Okay, today what we're going to do is move on from HTML and into another language which we call CSS. When I say move on from HTML, that doesn't mean that we're abandoning it. Okay, so I had a little interruption. I think I was saying that CSS is going to go along with HTML. So we're not abandoning HTML, but we are just enhancing it. So first we'll talk about what is CSS. And like I've been babbling about here, it's a language that works with HTML. You cannot create a web page that is just made with the CSS language. You can do that with HTML and create a web page with nothing else, but you cannot do that with CSS. And what CSS stands for is Cascading Style Sheets. And what it does is it actually just gives you, the web designer, more creative control over how things appear on your web page. So, for example, when we learned HTML, we learned about links, right? And we knew that links by default are blue and they're underlined. And you learned in HTML how you could change the color of a link, but what I said to you then was you can't remove the underline with HTML. So if you have a link that wants to show up on a button, maybe you don't really want it underlined. Well, CSS will allow you that freedom to remove the underline. Another example would be heading text. You know, we learned H1 all the way down to H6, but with CSS, you have all kinds of control over the size of text and appearance of text on your web page. So I hope that you really enjoy it, because this is a really great way to be able to enhance the format of your web page. So how does CSS work? Well, it works with what we call styles and style sheets. So when we talk about a style in CSS, basically that's just a rule. And it's a rule that's being applied to a portion of your web page content. And what it does is it describes how to format it. So it's similar to an HTML tag, except it can be very specific about one tiny little portion of a web page. And so when we work with CSS, we have a style sheet, and a style sheet is just a set of rules. So it's just a bunch of commands, okay? So a rule is, a style is just a CSS command, and a style sheet is just all of the commands together. So I'm going to talk to you just a little bit about the history of CSS. The World Wide Web has been around since the early 90s, the internet itself going back to the late 60s, but CSS was not officially released until 1996. And the funny thing about it is, yes, it was released in 1996. I've been teaching web design since 1997, like the 1997-98 school year. I did not start teaching CSS until probably around 2010 or 2011, I think is when I started. So you might think like, wow, Mrs. Rivera, you're like really far behind the times. It's been around since 96 and you didn't start teaching it for like another 15 years. Actually, the issue with it was that it wasn't compatible with a lot of browsers. Okay, I had a minor interruption again, so I don't remember exactly what I was saying. Just that CSS, even though it was around, it wasn't accepted by a lot of browsers, so it really at the time wasn't worth instructing because it wasn't a standardized thing. Now CSS is a standard accepted. Almost all CSS styles are handled well by browsers, and there are different versions that exist, but we use CSS3. When I first started teaching CSS, we used CSS2. CSS3 was out, but it wasn't yet the standard. So I waited until it became more of a standard with all the traditional web browsers. Okay, so let's talk about how great CSS is. And it's something that I truly appreciate only because I've been around forever, back in the day when we only used HTML for designing web pages. And one of the benefits of CSS is that it takes up less space. And when I say space, I mean file space. CSS is going to have smaller file size. And why would that even matter? Well, how it matters is that it makes the web page load faster in the browser. And the reason that that happens is because with CSS you don't need as many commands as you might with HTML. Again, remember, we're still using HTML, but we're doing most of the formatting in CSS. Another benefit, and this is a big one, is that it's easier to update a website. Now, when I say that, I mean the design of the website, not the content itself. The content is all still going to be HTML. But if I have a website and all of a sudden I decide that I want to change my color scheme and I want to change my fonts, I can do that with CSS in a really, really short amount of time as compared to HTML. And the other big benefit of using CSS is more formatting choices. And I already mentioned to you, for example, you can get the underline out of a link. You can increase the size of your text that you're limited to with HTML. So what you have is you have the ability to control colors, fonts, spacing, indents, etc. Okay, with HTML there was really not much you could do to indent text on a web page. There were some pretty goofy ways that, and like little hacks that people would use to try to make text indented, but with CSS you can actually really do it without trying to trick the browser into displaying something. Okay, so like I said, it goes hand in hand with HTML, and here's what we need to talk about for just a minute: the importance of correct HTML. So think about when we learned about HTML and we learned about tags. Most tags have closing tags. We talked about the syntax of them. Well, when we're adding CSS on top of HTML, you have to make sure that the HTML is correct, because if it's wrong, it can really mess up the web page itself. So I'm just going to put in here: improper HTML in a page can cause problems with CSS. And what it does, it puts it into something we call quirks mode, where it's just not working properly. So one of the biggest things is don't forget closing tags. See, with HTML, sometimes you can get a little lazy, and sometimes you can be a little sloppy, and it might actually show up on a web page the way you want it to. But when you start incorporating other languages to work with the HTML, it'll mess it up. So one of the things that's always advised to do is do what we call validating your HTML. So you validate it before you actually publish it on the internet. And so there is a site that you can use, and it's called validator.w3.org. And then W3 is just a consortium of the internet, and they help develop the standards for languages used for web pages. So I'll show you what that looks like in just a little bit here. Well, maybe I'll just do that right now really quickly. So let me pull up that website. This is what the page looks like when you get there. And then you can do several different things. You can validate if it's already something that's been published online, then you can just like give the URL for it right here. But what I do is I go to validate by file upload, I click on that tab, and then you just browse for the file. So I'm gonna pick a random file. And I'm going to click the check button, and it'll come up and give me any kind of errors. And you can see that right here. Okay, so here with my file, you can see some errors that it's finding, that there's a tag, but there was already one open. I don't have the encoding declared and things like that. So definitely something you always want to check out before you publish your page online. And I bet you if I pulled that web page that I just uploaded, if I pulled it up in my browser, it would look fine. But when I start incorporating CSS, it can definitely cause some issues. Okay, so one of the things, and this is kind of repeating what we did back with HTML, but we have that doc type tag. Doc type HTML with an upside down exclamation point. And we learned it with HTML, but it's also something that's just so important with CSS because it's used to identify the version of HTML, which for us is version 5. And again, this is being a little redundant. It goes above the regular HTML tag that we use, which is the HTML lang equals en. And if you leave it out, if you forget that doc type tag, then you're going to send the browser into quirks mode. Okay, so now I'm going to start talking to you about the syntax of how we do our CSS commands. And remember, instead of commands, we're going to call them styles, just like with HTML, we call them tags. And one of the things with CSS is we're going to type our commands in lowercase letters. When you watch me doing HTML samples, I always make my HTML tags capitalized. And I think I might have told you why I do that, because it stands out against the regular text, and so sometimes it's easier to go back and proofread it. It's not something that's necessary to do, it's just something that I choose to do. With CSS, we're going to do it all in lowercase letters. And CSS styles have two parts to them. So the two parts that we have are called the selector and the declaration block. Okay, so when we're looking at a CSS command, the selector is going to show up on the left side of the style. And it has a purpose, and its purpose is to identify the part of the page that we're trying to format. And we call that an element. But when I say element, it's just a part of the page. And there are all kinds of different elements or formatted areas that we could work with. So I'm just going to give you a couple of examples here. One would be like maybe we want to format the way a paragraph looks. So that would be P, as in the P tag for HTML. Maybe we're trying to change the way our heading looks. Maybe I used an H1 tag in HTML, and I'm going to use CSS to customize that. Then I would use H1. When we're typing this into a CSS command, they're not going to show up in parentheses. I just have them in parentheses here as an example. It would just be the text itself, like the letter P or H1. Maybe we want to use CSS to try to format our pictures on a web page. So in that case, I would use a selector on the left side of IMG. Again, that's attached to the HTML tags that we've learned. Okay, so the selector, again, is just stating what it is that we're going to change. So the declaration block, this is where all the magic happens of making your web page look the way you want it to. This is where you can be creative and artistic and make your web page pretty instead of just plain. So the declaration block, this is just the instructions for the browser. And so when we're looking at a CSS command, this is the part that appears on the right side of the style. I said style, yes. I meant to say right side of selector. And the declaration block is always going to show up inside curly brackets. And you know where those curly brackets are in your keyboard? If you look next to the letter P on that row on the right hand side, you do have to use the shift key with it, otherwise you'll get the regular brackets. Okay, examples of things that you might want to change inside a declaration block. One might be the size of something. You might want to change the color of something. You might want to change the position of something, or state it, clarify it. Maybe you're trying to add and format a border around something. Those are some of the things that you could do within a declaration block. Okay, I'm going to give you an example here of a CSS style. This will be an example of what a command would look like. Let's say we're trying to change the format of a heading in your web page. So on the left hand side, this is my selector, H1. Notice it's lowercase, not capitals. And then inside these curly brackets, I'm going to set my commands here. So I'm going to set color, pink. Then you'll see I'm putting a semicolon here. Font family, Arial. I just determined what my font would be, which we never even talked about with HTML. Font size, 96 pt, and then you'll see a semicolon there. And this would be an example. I just want to try to make it fit on one line so you can kind of see it. This would be an example of what a CSS style might look like. Now I put some spaces in between mine. I put color, space, space, pink. You don't have to do that. I just like it because it spaces it out a little bit, but if I wanted it to be like this, I could totally do it this way. This is all up to you. I could squish it all together. Some people like to put all of their statements on different lines. So some people would do it this way. Color pink. Font family Arial. Font size 96 pt, and then this like last bracket. And you can do that too. I choose not to do that because it takes up a lot of space, and I like to try to fit as much on a line as I can, but it's all up to you. Okay, so what you need to know are what these different parts are. And so in our example here, the H1, that again is the selector. That's what's being formatted. The text that shows up inside the brackets, that's the declaration block. And again, we've already defined those in our notes just up above. Now, where we look in our command here and we see color, font family, font size, those are called the property. That's what's being changed. And then looking at this command, if we look at the pink, if we look at the word Arial, if we look at this 96 pt, that is what we call the value. Okay, so we have the selector, we have the declaration block, We have the property, we have the value. So the property's defining what we're changing, and the value is giving the specifics of what to set it to, okay? Now, when we deal with this, each set of a property and a value is a declaration. So we know what a declaration block is. A declaration is each set of commands. So color colon pink right there, that's a declaration. Font family Arial, that's another declaration. Font size 96 pt, that's another declaration, okay? And one thing that you'll note is that each declaration in my example has a semicolon after it. That is something that you have to have, otherwise it will not work. Sometimes I can get frustrating. Maybe you create this web page, you add some CSS, it's not showing up on your page correctly. And the whole issue is that somewhere there's a semicolon that's missing, and sometimes that happens. So you'll see color colon pink, and then I have a semicolon. That's telling it, okay, that's the end of that declaration. Font family Arial, there's another semicolon, and even the very last one. So before your closing curly bracket, there always has to be a semicolon. That's the basics for CSS. And then as we transition into other sections within this unit, you'll be learning all the different things that you can do with the language and different kinds of commands and different ways of formatting. But this was just to give you a little introduction into how the language is used and the syntax and the purpose and all of that good stuff. So I'm going to have you save your notes and submit them to me, please, on Google Classroom, and then let me know if you have any questions.